Joining us this morning is Dr. Beñat Bilbao Osorio, one of the editors of the report. Beñat is the Associate Director and Senior Economist of the Global Competitiveness and Benchmarking Network at the World Economic Forum. In his duties, he carries out research on national competitive issues with special geographic focus on Latin America and Iberia. In addition, he also analyzes the role of innovation, information, communications technology, and fostering communication, and fostering competitiveness. He's the co-author of the Global Information Technology Report. Prior to his joining the forum, he worked as the Directorate General for Research and Innovation at the European Commission. He was responsible for economic analysis on European innovation policy at the Directorate of Science, Technology, and Industry and Education. His main fields are innovation, skills, economic development, where he is extensively published. Beñat holds a bachelor's degree in economics, a master's in European studies, and a PhD in economic geography from London School of Economic and Politics and Science. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Beñat Osorio. Please, thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Thanks. Muy buenos días a todos. Very good morning, everyone. Thank you very much, Jim, for the introduction. And it's a pleasure and an honor for me and the World Economic Forum to be here with you today to present an overview of the global digital landscape. This audience is very familiar and very well aware of the importance of ICT. As Jim already was mentioning in the welcoming remarks, we are in the middle of a digital revolution. The way that things have been doing and have been done are being changed completely. ICT is unlocking the productivity potential. We know that it's enabling innovation and at the same time is allowing to get better and more services for citizens, improving their well-being. But are all the different countries taking the full potential that ICT can actually leverage? Do all the different stakeholders in a particular country are making the efforts to actually benefit from the potential of this ICT? Can countries learn from each other in order to know why some countries are improving and going faster in terms of leveraging this ICT potential? Can there be some learning done there? These are some of the questions that for more than 13 years we have been questioning at the World Economic Forum through the Global Information Technology Report. That is one of our flagship publications that every year we publish in collaboration with Cornell University and INSEAD. So what we are trying to do with this report is, let me see if I can see this, the clicker. Sorry. We have a little bit of a technical problem here with the clicker. As you would expect from an IT conference, something should happen here with a clicker. I don't know if anyone from the organization has a different clicker that I can use. But basically what we are trying to do at the forum is try to assess how countries are leveraging their ICT potential. We are trying to see if there are countries that are doing better progress in terms of developing the ICT infrastructure, but also the conditions that are leading different stakeholders to take a higher benefit of this ICT. And for that, we have developed a model that is trying to summarize and take into account the complexity of a digital ecosystem. We know that there are many different factors that are affecting the capacity of the different countries to reap the full potential of ICT. It's not only about having the ICT technology, it's not only about having the mobile coverage for a country, it's not about having access to broadband, either mobile broadband or fixed broadband, but it's also what you actually do with this infrastructure. If you have the capacity to improve and to use effectively this infrastructure, and also if countries have the skills that are needed to make an effective use of this ICT. It is also very important to take into account which is the environment where the digital ecosystem is taking place. We know that we need to have a regulatory framework that is allowing companies to invest, that is allowing companies to actually transform the potential of ICT into innovations. And we know that it's also important to have a framework that is allowing for this entrepreneurial spirit and these innovations to occur. It's not just about having a digital infrastructure in place. We also know that what it is important to bear in mind in a digital ecosystem is to see, which is the commitment and the engagement of the different stakeholders in a society. We know that in order to improve the digital readiness of a country, this cannot be the responsibility. If we go to the next one, it's not only the responsibility of the government. Government is a very important player, it's an enabler of the digital ecosystem, but it's not only the responsibility of governments to improve the situation. So sorry about that technical problem. So what I was talking about is that we have created this tool that is our Network Readiness Index that is trying to assess and measure the ability of different countries to leverage this ICT to boost competitiveness and well-being. And I was also mentioning that this is not only, with this index, we're not only trying to measure the development of the ICT infrastructure, but a set of different elements that are important to bear in mind when you are talking about a digital ecosystem. We talk and we try to measure which is the friendliness of a country's regulatory framework for the development of the industry. We are measuring also the preparedness of an economy to actually develop this ICT infrastructure, very much related to the existence and availability of an ICT infrastructure. We are also talking about which are the actual efforts that the different stakeholders are carrying out in order to benefit from ICT. I was mentioning that it's not only the responsibility of the government, it's also the responsibility of the private sector. So many of you here are representing the business sector and the ICT industry. It's also your responsibility to contribute to the digital development of a country. And it's also the responsibility of the individual who has to make use of this ICT potential or capacities. And finally, we are trying to measure also the impacts that are coming from ICT. Because at the end of the day, having the ICT infrastructure is nice, but we want the ICT infrastructure in order to have the actual impacts that they can actually provide. And this is how we developed the framework that we have here on this slide, trying to encapsulate and accommodate all these different factors that are so important in terms of the digital ecosystem of a country. So we have the readiness area that is looking at the availability of ICT infrastructure, whether accessing this infrastructure is affordable or not, and whether in a country the skills that are needed in order to make an effective use of this infrastructure is in place. We are also measuring the efforts that the different stakeholders are doing in a country, so the government, the business sector, and the individual. And we also assess, which is the general framework, the environment where this digital ecosystem is taking place in terms of whether an effective innovation ecosystem exists or not, and whether the regulatory framework is effective or not in order to channel the different investments that are needed to develop the ICT infrastructure. In addition, what we also measure is the impacts, both the economic and the social impacts. And this is very important because at the end of the day, what people care about, what governments and what the industry care about is about having these impacts, either the economic impacts in terms of fostering productivity in an economy in order to foster innovation in an economy, or the social impacts that are very much related to the capacity to benefit in terms of the well-being of the citizens. We know that ICT has played and is playing a crucial role in education, in health, in providing better quality services in these areas, and this is also very much important. The final aspect that you need to bear in mind in this model is these bidirectional arrows, because we are really talking about a true ecosystem where all the different aspects are interrelated to each other and are affecting each other. So those countries that perform strongly in terms of developing their in a digital ecosystem are those that are capable of providing a good basis in all of the dimensions that we analyze in our framework. But as I was mentioning at the beginning, we tried to measure this ecosystem, and in order to have a measure, you need to have indicators, you have to have variables that are actually trying to figure out how the different countries are faring into the different dimensions of this ecosystem. So here we have calculated a composite index by using 54 indicators that it's sourcing from 2 different data sources. So the first one is what we call quantitative data that is coming from international organizations such as the ITU, the OECD, the World Bank, etc. These are giving us, some hard data elements about the development of the ICT infrastructure, the levels of skills that are available in an economy, etc. But in addition to that, we are also adding what we call some qualitative data that are coming from an annual survey that we administer every year among more than 15,000 business leaders, and that is giving us a little bit the qualitative approach to these elements. So they are very much focused about the business climate in one particular country, and we believe that having both dimensions together in this exercise is important to have a holistic picture of the situation of the digital ecosystem. So based on this analysis, we calculate our index and we provide a ranking that some of you may be familiar with. So the results for 2014, what we see is that the first 5 countries that are leveraging better their innovation ecosystem are the Nordic countries in Europe, countries like Finland, Sweden, or Norway. They are all in the top 5 of our ranking, where we analyze more than 148 economies. And we also see that there are some Asian tigers, especially Singapore, that are faring quite well in our index, as well as the Netherlands, that it's on 4th place. All these countries have recognized from a very early stage the importance of ICT to drive their economies, to provide better well-being to their citizens. They have been investing heavily. They have a clear and strong vision to develop the industry and also to spread the benefits into society, and have been investing quite importantly for many, many years. And that's why they score very high in our index. In addition, what we have in the top 10 is that you also have some other Western economies that are performing very strongly, all of them belonging to the top 10. Countries like Switzerland, the United States, Hong Kong, the UK, or Korea are really in the top 10. These countries have also identified very clearly the importance of ICT, and they have been investing a lot in developing their digital ecosystem, but also to create a close integration of the digital ecosystem with the innovation ecosystem, and that's why they perform so strongly. If we continue with the top 20 of our ranking, what we see mainly is that we basically find Western economies, advanced economies that are in the top 20. When we compare these results with those countries that appear in the second column of this table, what we see is one of the key learnings from the report this year, that it's that we still have this digital divide on the one hand between advanced economies, those countries that are on the left-hand side of the table, and some of the developing and emerging economies that are on the right-hand side of that table. We see, in addition to that, when we are comparing the results, that the second learning is that there are still very broad regional differences in terms of how countries in particular regions are leveraging ICT. So first of all, we see that there are a couple of countries like Qatar of the UAE that have identified clearly and that ICT is their way to diversify their economies. They are channeling important oil and gas resource income into ICT, and they are performing quite strongly. But when we compare it with other countries in the MENA region, in the Middle East and North Africa region, we see that there is a big differences in how countries are leveraging this ICT. For example, we see Egypt in position 91st. We see this as well in Latin America, the best performing country being Chile in 35th place out of 148 economies. But we see countries like Brazil or Mexico in the mid-range of our ranking, and countries like Peru that are lagging behind, for example, in the 90th place. So once again, we see this divergence within regions. The same happens for Spain, for Europe, sorry, where Finland or Sweden are leading the rankings, and then we find a country like Greece, which is really in the middle of the rankings in 74th place. And it's the same once again in Sub-Saharan Africa, for example, where you have Mauritius that is performing relatively strongly for the region in 40th place, but we also see many of the Sub-Saharan African countries ranking low in our ranking. So that's the second key learning. So the first one being the digital divide between advanced and emerging economies that still persists. The second one is the large intra-regional disparities within particular regions. And the third one is about the large emerging economies, so the BRICS and other large emerging economies, such as Mexico, for example, that we see that they are ranking in the mid-range of this classification. And this is important because for many years we are seeing that these countries are falling into some sort of glass barrier or glass ceiling where they are unable to break through and continue improving their digital ecosystem in comparative terms with more advanced economies. And this is also important because of the size and the importance of these economies and what can be their repercussions and the implications for the global economy overall, because we know that the economy, if not digital yet, it's becoming more and more digital, and it will be all will be digital. So if these countries are lagging behind, this can have also implications for the global economy going forward. So, but this is just a general classification. We can see that digital divide between the regions and the countries in this chromatic view, where we see that the green colored countries are those that are performing strongly, very much concentrated in North America and Europe and the Asian tigers. Then we see those countries performing more poorly in red and orange, and we see this divergence, this digital divide between advanced economies on the one hand and emerging economies on the other, and the large intra-regional disparities within particular regions. So we see these multicolor maps in Latin America, in Asia, in Sub-Saharan Africa. But this is giving you an overall perspective. In addition to that, what it would be interesting to know are two things. So the first one, in which areas do we see that there is the biggest gap between advanced economies and emerging economies? And also, what happens in dynamic terms? Are these countries catching up, or on the other hand, are they still lagging behind and we see little progress bridging this gap? So to answer the first question, what we see there is the difference between the performance of the advanced economies in red and the emerging economies in blue. There what we see is that the biggest gap that exists in terms of our index is in three particular areas. The first one is in terms of infrastructure and digital content. We are aware that there has been a lot done in emerging economies to expand the access to the mobile telephony, for example. But when we are analyzing more advanced type of infrastructure, like broadband, for example, we still see that lag is quite important between advanced and emerging economies. The second one is that in terms of the efforts and the use that the different stakeholders are doing, we see that the biggest gap is on the individual. We see in many countries of the emerging market that governments have been really behind there in making an effort to expand the digital ecosystem, but this has not been followed to the same extent by neither the business sector, that are still lagging behind in the use of ICTs, and also the individuals. And the third area where the lag is higher, and this is very important, is in terms of the economic impacts. Because what we see here is that there is a new digital divide that is occurring between advanced and emerging economies. This is not only in terms of ICT infrastructure, it's in terms of the impacts, on the economic impacts that different countries can benefit from ICT. And this is more and more important because at the end of the day, we are seeing that the potential of ICT is quickly being transformed into positive economic impacts. And here is where we see that the gap is happening more importantly. In terms of the second question that I was raising after the presentation of the rankings was in terms of dynamics. What do we see? Well, okay, there is a digital divide, but are we bridging this digital divide, or on the other hand, we see that there is not progress? So what we see here is that there is little progress when we analyze the dynamic results between advanced economies and emerging economies. Here we see that more or less all countries have been evolving in the same direction. We see that there has been progress, for example, in areas of infrastructure development and individual usage in developing countries, in emerging countries, but this has gone in line with the progress that we have seen in advanced economies. And what it is more importantly is that there seems to exist little progress in terms of the economic impacts. This still remains very strongly. But not all, and this is particularly applicable when we talk about the BRICS economies, these large emerging economies, where we see that the only area where there has been some progress over time is in terms of the individual usage. For the rest, we see that they have had a very stable profile. But not all is bad news, let's say, in terms of bridging this digital divide, because we see that some countries have been making efforts. So for example, when we take the case of Southeast Asia, we see there that compared to the results of last year, some countries like Indonesia have made relatively good progress in improving their digital ecosystem. Also, in Latin America, for example, we see that some countries have made good efforts, such as Peru or Colombia, where they both go up in our ranking. And in addition to that, what we see is that in general, there are also a set of countries that are actually improving the situation in the index, so they are better leveraging their ICT ecosystem. And here we find those countries that are situated in the upper part of that chart. Countries in the Gulf, like the UAE or Qatar, making strong efforts to leverage their ICT potential. Also, we see this in countries in Central Asia, countries like Kazakhstan, for example, or Georgia, doing significant efforts to better leverage their ICT potential, but also in Latin America. So we see countries like Panama, for example, or Ecuador that are going up and making decisive steps into the right direction in terms of developing a more solid and robust digital ecosystem. And this is also important to know because there can be lessons that can be learned from these countries in terms of how they are proceeding to improve their digital ecosystems. And with that, I would like just to provide a brief summary of these learnings of how at the World Economic Forum we see the global digital landscape evolving. So the first of all, again, is this idea that there is a digital divide between advanced and emerging economies. And more importantly, that this digital divide is taking a new nature. We are talking about a new digital divide because between technology-savvy nations and those that are lagging behind, especially because we are talking about in terms of impacts, of economic impacts particularly. So this is an important idea to bear in mind. The divide still persists. And this is especially clear when we actually analyze the situation of large emerging economies, where we see that there is still not sufficient progress And it is important that these countries, but all other countries that are lagging behind, recognize the importance and value that ICT can play, and then they start working in the right direction in terms of adopting those measures that are needed to improve the situation. And these measures that are needed include, of course, investment in ICT infrastructure, investment in developing the right set of skills that are needed to take advantage of the ICT, but also in terms of developing the conditions, the framework conditions that are important for these countries to, on the one hand, channel investments into the right areas, but also to create the right conditions for innovation and entrepreneurship that are going to give the necessary economic impacts that ICT can enable, because by doing that, these countries will be able to create and to support greater social cohesion, creating more opportunities for all, and also increase the level of productivity and the potential for growth. So this is a little bit the key message that I would like to leave with you with this session, and also hopefully it will allow you to put into perspective many of the things that are going to be discussed during these 2 days here in Guadalajara. So with that, I would like just to thank you very much for your attention, and I'm here for any questions you may have. Thank you.
Thanks very much. You stay up here for a moment.